The Psalms of Book 3 need to be understood in light of their historical context. The Psalms of Book 3 were compiled following the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. It's difficult for us to understand the magnitude of this catastrophe. Jeremiah tells us, Jeremiah was an eyewitness of these events, and he tells us that there were 5,000 survivors who went into exile. Now, we're told back in the book of Exodus that the nation of Israel at that time numbered in the millions. And so can you imagine the devastation that had been wrought on this nation that was down to its last 5,000 people? It must have felt like the end of the nation, and an image of this is what happens when a civilization dies. It must have felt apocalyptic as you see this artist's rendition of the incredible suffering and plundering that took place at this moment. Not only were the eyewitnesses of this event traumatized by what they experienced and saw, but they also had deep theological questions. Number one on their list was, how could God possibly abandon his temple, his house? 400 years earlier, God had showed up in a visible way. The glory of God descended and came and filled the temple, but now God seemed to have abandoned his own house. Not only that, but he had abandoned his king, his anointed. He had made promises to David that a descendant of David would be on the throne forever and ever. And yet the king of the time, King Zedekiah, tried to escape this catastrophe, but he was captured, and every one of his sons was put to death before his eyes. And in a final act of cruelty, the king of Babylon then had Zedekiah's eyes put out, so that the last thing that he saw was the death of his children. It seemed that the line of David had been cut off. And finally, God had promised to be the shepherd of Israel, to care for them and be with them and rescue them. And indeed, he had many times in the past. And yet it seemed at this point that God had abandoned his people. He had hid his face from them. He had walked away and left them on their own. And so the Psalms of this book, while not all written during this time, were collected likely for the survivors of this national catastrophe to try to reconcile their experience with what they knew to be true of God. The Psalms of Book 3 address this question of theodicy. Theodicy is defined as the problem of evil in the context of divine good. In other words, how can God be good and all-powerful and allow evil and suffering and pain to exist? So philosophers will say God cannot be both all-powerful and all-good. If he were good, he wouldn't allow suffering. If he were powerful, he would stop it. So the problem goes, well, he can't be both of those. So how do we reconcile those two issues, God's omnipotence and God's benevolence? These Psalms also show special concern for Israel's moral responsibility to the Lord for her sin and the disasters that it's brought. In other words, Israel is not innocent in this matter. Perhaps the reason that God abandoned his people was that they had abandoned him long beforehand. And so there is something to be said for divine justice and discipline as well. And so these Psalms will wrestle with that issue as they process what has happened to the nation through poetry and song. The songs of Book 3 divide themselves into two groups. There is first the Asaphite collection. These first 11 Psalms, 11 of the 12 Psalms of Asaph are found here in Book 3. And you can see they somewhat defy outlining. There seems to be an opening psalm of wisdom, Psalm 73, and then just a series of psalms that sort of randomly deal with the issues that the destruction of the temple has posed. It does seem that the central psalm of the Asaphite collection is Psalm 78. It's a lengthy psalm. It has actually 77 Hebrew verses. It's the longest psalm in Book 3, and scholars will say that this is, in fact, the central psalm, and it is a long historical explanation for Israel's suffering. You might ask at this point, well, who was Asaph? Well, Asaph was both an individual and a family name. You can look him up in the book of 1 Chronicles, and you'll see that he is the son of Berechiah, descendant of Gershon, the son of Levi. The name Asaph itself means collector, and this has caused some people to think that Asaph was more of a guild or a collector, represents a collection of psalms. Although he certainly was an individual. In 1 Chronicles 6:39, David appoints a man named Heman as the main musician, singer, and Asaph as his right-hand assistant, with the Merarites at his left hand. So he was both a man and a guild of musicians, most likely. He's even mentioned by name as performing the dedication of the first temple. So there is some significance in the fact that Asaph was eyewitness to the first temple dedication, and then the descendants of Asaph were witnesses of the destruction of that temple some 400 years later. It's clear that some of these psalms of Asaph were written by eyewitnesses to the fall of the temple. The second group of psalms in Book 3 are those primarily of the sons of Korah, with a few others. As you can see there are 2 psalms of the sons of Korah, 84 and 85, and then a psalm of David, and then 2 more by the sons of Korah. Now, if you're doing the math, that adds up to 12 psalms of the sons of Korah, 4 here and 8 back in Book 2. And then, as we noted earlier, 12 psalms of Asaph, 11 here in Book 3, and 1 back in Book 2. That makes it easy to remember. 12 psalms of the sons of Korah, 12 of Asaph. 12 being a nice biblical number representing the nation of Israel, the 12 tribes, the community of God. So we have the Psalm of David that's here in the middle of this group, and then corresponding to that Psalm of David, Psalm 89 of Ethan the Ezrahite. This is the only psalm that is attributed to him in the Psalter. And as we'll see, this psalm has a pretty strong connection to David, appealing to God's faithfulness, particularly in his covenant with David. And so there is a connection between 86 and Psalm 89. So there's an outline of the book, and as you will see as we go through this, there's not a definite chronological or theological flow to these psalms, in my opinion. They do feel somewhat random, but they are all dealing with this trauma of the destruction of the temple, the fall of Jerusalem, and the exile. And in that way, they really represent how we deal with trauma and grief as well. Often it comes in waves, and we process it at different times in different places in different ways. And so I think you'll find this book extremely helpful when you are going through a process of questioning or of frustration or of grieving a loss. These Psalms give us the words to pray in those times.